Afternoon and good morning, and welcome all to this national oration of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, with the support of the ACT Division and the Australian National University. Let me first of all acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, in our case here in Canberra, the Ngunnawal people. Pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge too the power and the importance of their traditional knowledge for our modern science and technology. So my name is John Dixon. I'm chair of the ACT Division of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. This is a hybrid event with a live audience within the Research School of Social Sciences in the Australian National University, and with many people online. And we welcome you all. As a hybrid event, we shall have questions both from the audience and later from the Q&A button, when we will select from the Q&A button the relevant questions that we can fit in the time available. So the title of this oration is unusual but very fitting. It is Messages Passing Through. And Messages Passing Through blends together a lot of the key elements of the work of the Academy that brings together science and engineering and communications. And this focuses on one historic event and what some might call an impossible engineering feat, the building of the Overland Telegraph Line from Darwin to Adelaide, which connected southern Australia to the rest of the world. So that was momentous in all sorts of senses. And it was also a feat, an interdisciplinary exercise of technology, of human, of ecological systems working together. And that's one of our themes within the Academy. It's now my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished professor, Genevieve Bell, who will present the oration. Genevieve has, after many years in the Silicon Valley, which was set up, I could almost say, by a PhD in cultural anthropology at Stanford University, which led into product development and that huge dynamic system at Intel, which then set up Genevieve so well to come back to establish the 3A Institute at ANU in collaboration with CSIRO Data 61 on cybernetics, which was a milestone for Australia. And then Genevieve went on to lead the School of Cybernetics at ANU, and now we're very pleased to say is Vice-Chancellor and President of the Australian National University. I can't imagine anybody more fitting or better to draw out the implications of this historic analysis of the Overland Telegraph Line. Please do remember, for those of you online, insert any of your questions at the Q&A button, and for those of you here live, we'll have a roving mic. So Genevieve, over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for that incredibly gracious introduction and for basically giving my talk. So I think I can go now and we can just go back outside in the sunshine. I realise that's not true. Look, I wanted to start by making a couple of really kind of clear guiding remarks here. I'm really pleased that the Academy invited me to come and talk on this topic. It lets me step away from my job as Vice-Chancellor. So imagine this is me stepping out of the Vice-Chancellor job and into the role as a Distinguished Professor in the School of Cybernetics. The work I want to reflect on is work I've done with a number of my colleagues. I know some of them are online, so I want to shout out to Andrew Mears and Isabel is there too. Hello to Isabel, who I imagine is in a different country. This work is work that we have generated collectively over a number of years, and so I'm pulling on multiple people's work here. John reflects it's an unusual title for a talk. The title is drawn from a newspaper clipping from 1889, reflecting on a visit to far regional South Australia by the then governor of the state. And he reflects as he is taking a horse and buggy over a sand dune to find himself nearly 800 kilometres from Adelaide, that he was in a place that, despite its great distance, seemed endlessly connected to the rest of the world. And he talks about the contrast of this remoteness and the idea that he was in a place where messages passed through, and that people in that place knew more about the rest of the world than he himself knew. And there's something about that tension of remoteness and connectivity that I want to dwell on a little bit today. So as John said, this is a talk about the Overland Telegraph Line. You might imagine this is also a parable. In my current role and other roles, I get asked to talk about artificial intelligence a lot. And while there are lots of things you can say about artificial intelligence, I find they sometimes fall on deaf ears. And so instead, I want to give you a parable about artificial intelligence, but also a talk about an incredibly significant engineering accomplishment, both in the making and in the doing. Before I do all of that, though, I want to also acknowledge where we are today, on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, to acknowledge as I do that we're on land that was always sacred and never ceded, and that it's not enough to acknowledge anymore. We need to sit with the discomfort of what it means to be in this place, and to work through what it means to have these acknowledgements, and to be attentive to the fact that it's not enough to acknowledge anymore. We need to do more than that. We need to think about our commitments personally, I think professionally and institutionally. And for me, being able to say where we are and on whose country we are feels like an appropriate way to start almost any event. I spent 30 years overseas, as John mentioned, and one of the things that I'm always struck by is the names I didn't hear called in that period. I think about what it means not to have heard the names of the Lenni Lenape and the Mashantucket Pequot and the Algonquin and the Ohlone and the Shoshone Bannock, all lands on whose lands I lived on, and those names were never called. And there's something about those silences that sits heavy here for me, and also about what that means, I think, for places like this. At the end of last year, one of my PhD students for the school got up and gave her thesis proposal review. Some of us will remember what that is. It is an arcane ritual where you defend your idea to the people you hope will be your community. And you hope that they will embrace you and welcome you with your ideas and make your ideas better through their questions and their challenge. At the end of her acknowledgement, she said that she wanted to think not just about how she acknowledged where she was, but what she committed to with her labour. And I think about that in my role. What do I commit to when I acknowledge where I am? And what I commit myself personally to is much like Michelle did. I commit that my labour and my work should mean something. But I think as a professional and as someone who has institutional authority here, it's also about where I want the university that I steward to be in those conversations, and about what our responsibility is as the national university, to be mindful about how we move from acknowledgement to truth, reconciliation, justice, sovereignty, self-determination, resurgence, that those will be uncomfortable conversations, but I tend to imagine the role of universities is to be the place where uncomfortable conversations are held and where truths emerge from them. And so I want to acknowledge where I am, but I want to commit to it being more than simply a ritual that we blow through. This talk starts with this object. It's about this size. It sits nearly 800 kilometres north of Adelaide, beside the Unadata track. So if you close your mind and think of a map of Australia, go to the middle, come down a little bit. If you opened up Google Maps and typed in the name of the cattle station nearest to this, there would be a blank on the map. I told a colleague of mine we were going there. He's from Trinity in Dublin. And I said, open a map, type in this name. And he said, oh, I broke Google. Zoom out just a little bit. He's like, nah, still broken. Zoom out a bit more. He's like, where are we going? Like, we're going to a place that was the center of everything in the 1800s, but it's still the center of some things, but not of this particular story. This little tiny stump is a piece of cypress, burnt cypress to be precise, that was planted in this place in about October of 1870. It was planted by a collection of people who worked for a man named Edward Mead Bagot. And Edward Mead Bagot and his construction company had just won a contract to string the Overland Telegraph Line from Port Augusta to a place called Charlotte Waters. In the instance of this pole, there was also a surveyor who was surveying the route. His name was Benjamin Herschel Babbage. That should be a familiar name to some of us because that is indeed Charles Babbage's son. So Babbage got sent off to Australia and found work as a surveyor and found himself surveying this route in 1870, making a determination about where someone else should put tree stumps. At that point, slightly larger. If you stand on this dirt road and you look at this little tiny piece of cypress and you look at this photo where you can see white ceramic, you're of course looking at insulators that would have once held the wire onto that tree in that place. Something as fragile as this is still there, 53 years later, being in the place that it was, making what's possible. And I want to take this as the jumping off point to tell you a story and a parable. It's a story that starts, like many stories about technology, with a confluence of technological advances. In the 1820s and 1830s in England and in the United States, people were experimenting with how to use electricity, not just to power things, but to send signals. They were experimenting with how to use wire as a conduit around which you could push electricity and through which you could send a signal. Some of the early experiments are terrible. They're an attempt to use the electrical current to move a needle across a board. Think Ouija board, but with actual letters on it. They were attempting to operate flags at a distance. Think semaphore, but slightly more coded. All of the challenges with this had to do with distance. Clearly, a visual-based electrical telegraphy system was only good in daytime and only good to the edge of the horizon. The ones that involved choosing between blocks of messages were like the very early ones we would have had of trying to use text messaging on a Nokia candy bar phone where you were having to push your way through everything. Not good for much communication. They were fragile, they were expensive, they required expert operators, and they did not get to scale. But what they started to suggest to lots of people in England and in the United States and France, it was possible to imagine shackling the newest technologies and taking it to greater distance. And if you could communicate that way and you could separate the act of communication from paper and a person and a mechanism of transportation and have it be something that could flow through a wire, it opened up a whole new set of possibilities. For some people who are experimenting that, they're very clear about what it is they want to be able to do. Signal time. Because, of course, that has to do with railways, right? Sharing a line, you need to be able to know what the time is so that you don't create accidents. And so telegraphy looked like an excellent way of sending time signals to coordinate telegraphy and to coordinate timetabling. In the United States, there were ideas that maybe you'd be able to send information. That information might be useful. We're clearly in a period in the early 1800s where information is all about changing political fates, making businesses, worrying about war. And some of the earliest instantiations of telegraphy were indeed on the part of military organizations. But what you have in this period in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s is multiple technologies that are growing up, in some ways codependently. We recognize this phenomena. You have people experimenting with containing power and holding it. So battery technology, basically, but battery technology with chemicals. On the left here is an illustration of one of the earliest of these technologies of containing power that would be useful for telegraphy. That's a Meidinger cell invented by Meidinger, who was a German chemist, who worked out that you could use copper sulfate and copper plates to generate a power source that would run continuously for at least 3 weeks and dissipate a slow, steady charge, about the same as a AA battery. If you can do that and you can have a constant charge, it starts to make possible systems that will run over protracted periods of time. It's also a relatively easy system to manage. All you need to do is put copper sulfate into it periodically and make sure you have clean water, and that you take out the plates about once a year, tap all the crystals off them and stick them back in the jar again. Now, of course, you need more than one jar to do anything interesting. And much of these systems develop around battery banks. So think hundreds of these little jars. They're about this size. So think a good Fowler's or of a cola jar, about the size where you'd put half a dozen peaches, about that size, right? So you have that happening. You have people experimenting with various forms of signal, and it's all experiments at this point, John. Haven't got the math right. They're engineering the system, but they don't actually entirely understand why some of it is working. And in America, a man named Samuel Morse, who is not a technologist, he's an artist, he's a painter at this moment in time. He realizes that there's something about how you might encode information to transmit it electronically that is interesting. He's heard people talk about telegraphy. He's seen Wheatstone, which is the original, basically, electronic Ouija board. It's a terrible way to describe it, but it is a needle-based system. And he wondered if there was something else you could use. And he was really interested in the idea of dots. He's a painter, and he thinks dots and dashes, maybe you can get to a language. He thinks maybe dots and dashes can be made into sound. And sound might be a thing you could code and encode. And he convinces people in Washington, D.C. to give him a bit of money. He builds a system from D.C. to Baltimore, and they run down the line for a bit. People aren't very interested. He's also charging money for it. People are less interested in that. But it becomes clear that this travels faster than a piece of paper. That travels faster than a newspaper. That travels faster than a train. And if you can disentangle time that way, you start to have advantages. Advantages in military strategy, advantages in business. People might want to be able to make that work. And so telegraphy systems start to appear. In the UK, next to railway lines. In the US, independent of railway lines, but running closer to them. In Australia, telegraphy appears in 1853 in Melbourne with a man named Samuel McGowan, who was an American disciple of Morse and who comes to Victoria with the idea of bringing telegraphy to Australia. He encounters a whole lot of people who aren't very interested, and he has to go through an entire process of explaining to people why this technology is interesting, why people should invest in stringing wires on poles where those haven't historically been true. He needs to convince the newspapers to start running stories to help Melburnians understand the cobweb of information that strings above them. And I imagine he was a bit lonely. There's nothing like being the first person who sees a technological future and attempting to convince other people they should buy in. Attempting to convince people that they should part with money or resources or give you a seat at the table when you've seen a future that they don't believe in. And I imagine he was very pleased when a man named Charles Todd was sent from London to South Australia. Charles Todd at this point is young. He's a mathematician, a computer we would have called him in those days. He's a son of a tea merchant, a little boy who ends up in school in London because the city government in London has decided that everyone should be educated to the age of 12. And so suddenly we have a change in the education systems in London in the 1830s and 40s. Todd is identified as being mathematically gifted. He's sent to the observatory at Greenwich and finds a whole lot of people to keep him company. And he and all those little boys doing calculations, he's the one who emerges as someone who is better than just the numbers. He can also talk to people, and he can see how the pieces that he is building aggregate up to something bigger. And the head of the observatory starts giving him more and more tasks. And in the early 1850s, the head of the observatory is asked to identify someone to send to South Australia to start an observatory there. And he picks someone, and that person goes to Canada. He picks someone else, and they take a different job. And Todd is number 3. And when he's offered the opportunity to go to South Australia, he leaps at it. He makes a rash proposal of marriage to a very young girl and drags her with him. And they turn up in Adelaide, him being charged to build an observatory, being tasked by his previous mentor to understand the weather and being tasked by the governor of South Australia to build a telegraphy system. And he and McGowan become fast friends. They correspond with each other. I'm sure McGowan is pleased to have someone else who cares about telegraphy and who's been educated in one of the centres of excellence around it, which was at that point Greenwich in the United Kingdom. Todd also encounters the same problems in South Australia that McGowan has hit in Victoria. People are like, what do we want telegraphy for? We've already got systems. They work just fine. This thing you're asking seems messy and complicated. It's got wires everywhere, like there's this battery thing, what the hell? And he perseveres and he builds the first system, and people start to realize, actually, it's really useful to know what's arrived in the port in the city. And while we all know Port Adelaide and the city aren't that far apart, it's just enough that you can make different decisions. And so he slowly wins people over. He builds telegraph stations spreading out from Adelaide into the regions. And he and McGowan do a deal to connect Adelaide and Melbourne. And suddenly it stops being boats that take information, and there's now real-time communications. And Australians do all the things you would expect if we have real-time communications in the 1800s. We gamble. We attempt to rort horse races. We attempt to inveigle political dissent. We do all the things that you might imagine we would do under those circumstances. And I like to fantasize about what was flowing on the line between Adelaide and Melbourne in the 1850s. Mostly trouble is my vague sense of that. And of course, information is still flowing on boats because that's the only way things come to Australia at that point. Inside Australia, sure, we start to develop networks. To get to Australia, it's still a boat. And even in the 1850s, as boats have gotten faster and cleverer and quicker and have more capacity, it's still 45 days on the fastest clipper with the wind behind you to get news from London to Adelaide and telegraph to Sydney and Melbourne. Perth is not in this story because they were offered telegraphy and didn't want it. You may take that as you see fit about stories about Western Australia and the rest of Australia. So advances are happening. But at this point in time, all the telegraphy there is land-based. They've built a system in India that goes all the way over land back to London. One tiny piece of bit between the channel. The US is building systems across the world. And in England and in Germany, there are two people experimenting with how you might submerge cables. Because if you can submerge cables, now you're connecting whole continents, not just countries. But it turns out sticking copper underwater is a kind of complicated thing. First attempt, wrap it in linen dipped in tar. Turns out it sinks immediately to the bottom because it gets really heavy really quickly, and it's really hard to pull back up again, and it doesn't actually solve the copper water problem. So big failure, expensive failure, some spectacular problems with it. Until one of the Siemens brothers works out that there is a plant that grows in Malaysia, the sap of which changes its properties when you put it underwater. And that plant is called gutta percha. That's what it looks like in all the beautiful diagrams. The trees are like meters and meters tall. When you extract the gutta percha, it's like extracting rubber, same set of processes. And every single one of you, I'm willing to bet, in this room and through that camera, have encountered gutta percha and you haven't known it. So think about being in a library or a used bookstore. Think about that faint smell of vanilla or that faint smell of mustiness in an old bookshop. You're tempted to think it's the books themselves. It kind of is, because it turns out gutta percha was first used for bookbinding. It's the glue that was used to hold the pages in. So books between the 1850s and 1900 frequently have gutta percha in the spine, and that smell you have in libraries is the smell of it decaying slowly. But when you weren't using it for bookbinding, what you could do was make conduit out of it. And when you made conduit out of it and wrapped that piece of copper, wrapped in steel, embedded still in linen dipped in tar, and wrapped in gutta percha, you could drop it to the bottom of an ocean. You could drop it hundreds and thousands of feet underwater, and it would still carry a signal. And once you could do that, you can now imagine not just connecting countries, but continents. And once you do that, you create an entire new economy and an entire new set of players. So up until then, in the US, It's an early version of what becomes AT&T. It's basically all the early versions of the people that were telegraphy companies. In the UK, it's a bunch of companies. But now, this is what emerges. An entire new economy of undersea cables connecting countries and continents. 90% of them owned by only two companies, Siemens and something called the Eastern Telegraphy Company, which in our lifetimes would have been known as Cable and Wireless. In this period of time, they are running around the globe connecting things up. And this changes many things, because now you can connect country to country. Now those things that required boats can go quicker. Now we are starting to shape different categories of information. What can flow on a telegraph line? What requires paper? What requires a body? What can flow effectively in a proto-digital way? One of the people involved in this, the chairman of the Eastern Telegraphy Company, is a man named John Pender. And John Pender was an ambitious man who was determined to make his company a global going concern. By the late 1800s, he had the largest R&D lab in a non-commercial, in a non-kind of university space, other than Edison in the United States. The Eastern Telegraphy R&D lab is run by Oliver Lodge, who some of us will recognize as the chair of the Royal Society of London and the progenitor of radio experiments in Great Britain, among other things. But in the 1880s, he ran the development shop for this company. John Pender employed a man named Cyrus Fields. And if John was an ambitious, hard-charging money man, Cyrus Fields was everything you expect from a sales guy. And he could convince you that what you needed more than anything else in the world was undersea cables. And Australia doesn't have any in the 1860s. And Todd and McGowan, they know they want them because they know that's what's coming. They've been reading the papers. They understand that getting cables underwater is a thing. And Fields comes on a boat with the offer of, we will bring the cable. We've got it to Singapore. We'll bring it south. We'll bring it to somewhere on the northern coast of Australia if you pay for the last piece of connection, because it was expensive, and if you do a deal with us that we will carry your signal. He starts in Perth, where they go, telegraphy. So he keeps going on the boat, gets to Adelaide, and Todd does a deal, because Todd says to him, I will not only give you the money to connect South Australia first, I'll pay you not to keep going. Do not go to Melbourne and Sydney. Certainly don't go to Brisbane. You will stay here and we will do a deal. And do a deal they do. The deal is struck that Todd will strike a line from Adelaide to Darwin, and that he will meet the cable in a place called Port Darwin, which barely exists in this moment in time, and that he will meet them there, not just geographically, but temporally. So he will meet them there in the same amount of time it takes them to unspool a cable under the ocean to get from Singapore to Darwin. They will drive the line all the way up. And driving the line all the way up in this particular moment in time, in 1870, we have people living, white people living to here. So Port Augusta is as far north as it has been surveyed for the purposes of building things. Beyond Port Augusta, it's a little more uncertain. From Alice Springs to Darwin, there is very little European settlement, and there's been one explorer to date. In 1870, in agreeing that he will do this, Charles Todd is also agreeing that he will survey this entire region. He will find a line for the line, that he will collect enough material to make this happen. That means, as it turns out, 36,000 poles, 40,000 insulators, 4,000 miles of number 6 fencing wire, and enough people to dig holes in the ground every 80 metres to stick those poles in them, and build a repeater station, i.e. a booster station, every 250 miles to make it work. And he's just committed that he's going to do all of this in less than 20 months, which does feel extraordinarily brave. We might have said, Minister, that is brave. And they sign the deal. And it goes to legislation, South Australian colony agrees, and in June of 1870, they go. Best understanding of how to run a continental telegraph system, because there have been others in the world, this is still the biggest, but then others was you divide it into pieces, so section it out, build concurrently, not consecutively, and go. So there's a simultaneous build from Port Augusta to Charlotte Waters, from Charlotte Waters, mostly Alice Springs to Darwin, three sections, 3 surveyors, 3 teams. All the camels in Australia get seconded to this project, so about 200 of them. There's about 1,000 people. There is a lot of gear and some really complicated problems. Telegraphy at this point doesn't need a lot. It needs wire and batteries and water and humans. But not a lot is actually a lot, right? It needs places to put the poles. It needs water, because remember, those batteries, that's still what we're powering this with. Wet cell copper sulfate batteries, they need pure water. Poles. Everywhere else in the world, the instruction is just chop down a tree. Bit of an issue. And then build a building every 250 miles and stick people in it. Now, for Europeans, this is unexplored country. This is, in some ways, empty, is the narrative. For First Nations people, this is tens of nation states you are flowing through, multiple places of cultural significance. If you are looking for water, you are bound to be hitting places that are hugely significant, that are sacred sites, that are cultural sites. You are crossing boundaries of nations as you do all of this, and you are doing it very quickly, very abruptly, and very permanently. This becomes one of the lines of the colonial frontier in the space of a season, and it is irrevocably changing this entire region. Todd is aware of this. He gives very clear instructions to his people about what they need to do, both with regard to how they will comport themselves, about the importance of hard work, but also taking time off, about clean living, also about how you will deal with Aboriginal people, which is respectfully at a distance. Do not attempt to fight with them, raise machinery at them. It's very clear about what he thinks needs to happen in all of this. And they go. And they complete this link in time, almost. They start in June of 1870. They are done by August of 1872. Fields has brought the cable to Darwin quicker than that, but he has a failure of the underwater cable. So everyone's deal is still holding, right? Because it wasn't just about bringing it there, you have to bring it working. And so the cable has turned up, but not so much is flowing through it. So we have some interesting kind of challenges there. In order to avoid the very last set of financial hurdles, Todd has a 250-mile section that he runs a Pony Express on. So telegraphy gets to Darwin, comes through the cable, goes to the pony, gets back to the cable, and off you go again for 3 months, which feels complicated. But in August of 1872, when the initial line is built and turned on, we suddenly go from 44 days on the fastest boat to less than 8 hours. And a lot of people's work, because it's now going Adelaide, Port Augusta, Beltana, Strangway Springs, the Peak, Charlotte Waters, Alice Springs, Barrow Creek, Tennant Creek, Powell Creek, Daly Waters, Catherine, Yam Creek, Darwin, Banjawahi, Jakarta, Singapore, Penang, Chennai, Mumbai, Aden, Cairo, Gibraltar, Malta, Lisbon, Porthcurno, London. Feels like a lot, but when it was 44 days to 8 hours, that's a huge transition. And everyone talks about what an extraordinary thing it is. And the reality is that is a remarkable engineering feat. And to John's point, it is one that in some ways is part of the history of Australia. It's part of the history of ATSE. It's also in and of itself a remarkable engineering story, because when this was built, we still didn't have the telegraphy equation. So some of us know the telegraphy or the telegrapher's equation as the equation that talks about signal loss. But this got built before anyone actually understood the maths of what they were doing. They knew how to build it. They were experimenting in real time. They were building it in real time. But for me, John, I've always thought the more significant thing here isn't the building of it, but the keeping of it. Because it's one thing to build this. it's another thing to keep operating it all this time. And so if this were a parable of AI, this is where every AI story would stop. Because they're like, right, we built the thing and now it's go, woof. And then we would never talk about all the other things. Which is, it doesn't work unless you have people who know how to make it work. So it turned out running a continental scale telegraphy system involved expert labor. And that expert labor is really particular. They need to be highly literate. They also need to understand Morse code. They need to be able to hear it, not just read it. They need to be willing to work in 12-hour shifts, because these guys did. These systems were open 24/7. The Australian system is unlike any other system in the world. Every other telegraphy system that is global in this period of time, you turn it on to operate it. In Australia, you break the circuit to start it, not start the circuit to make it work, because of course we are talking about such distances that you need to know if the system isn't working before you start using it. So this system runs live continuously in this period. Slow electrical discharge dissipating through the wires. Not enough to really hurt you, but enough that you would know if it wasn't working. And sitting in every one of those little repeater stations on that dot on the map are expert laborers who know how to think about electrical circuits, because they're our first electrical engineers. What are they running inside these shops? Electrical circuits. There's two: the full line, which is a circuit, and the circuit of all the tools inside the machine, inside the repeater stations. They needed to understand Morse code. They needed to be able to follow a set of rules, because it turned out what's flowing on that line is information. And that information is, well, power. Social scientist will tell you. At least in this sense, it required privacy and controls and rules, and all of them had to sign up to a series of contracts about it. And they signed up to putting on a dress shirt every morning in the most remote places and being very proper about what they were doing. For them to do their work, they also relied on work crews. Because if you're running 3,000 kilometre line in the middle of Australia through some of those places, you are talking about things that are incredibly, on the one hand, robust, because it's kind of crazy, right? On the other hand, they're really fragile. The wire here is number 6 fencing wire. So the stuff that's on a fence you currently have is what they're running the signal through. And the posts, they might have been burnt cypress, but turns out the white ants of South Australia just don't care. They're going to eat anything. And eat anything they did, most of this. And it turns out if you have poles in the middle of a desert or in flat country, they get hit by lightning a lot. Turns out frogs in the north like to climb up inside the insulators and die. It turns out a lot of things happen. And you spend your entire time repairing the line. Because once you've also convinced people that being connected 24/7 is the right answer, if this goes down, you violate that promise. And so every repeater station, in addition to having expert labourers, had work crews. And those work crews patrolled the line every day. And every day they were working to clear the line so that you could see it, and you could see the pieces of it, to replace it, to maintain it, to look after it. They too were expert labourers in different ways, right? They knew how to repair the system, they knew how to diagnose it. Most of them actually knew how to use Morse code. Most of them could tell by the way the signal decayed where the break in the line was, so they knew how to fix it. Of course, in Australia, we had to pass law in the 1800s to make disrupting the line illegal, because people broke the line to get rescued. Because when the signal went down, someone went to fix it, and if you were stuck somewhere in Australia, finding a telegraph line and cutting it was a really easy way of getting yourself saved. Or there is in at least one instance in the 1890s, a case of a guy hitchhiking by breaking the line. Break the line, get taken to the next repeater station, get fed, walk out, break the line, get picked up and taken to the next repeater station. It was 3 repeater stations before anyone twigged to the fact that he might have been hitchhiking down the wire. If you have all of those expert crews living in all those places with all that technology, you also need a supply chain to keep bringing things to them, right? You need more copper sulfate. You need glass jars, because they don't always last. You need copper plates. You might need food. You'll need flour. You need a telegraph book to write all the things down in. You need a ledger. You need equipment. And it turns out there aren't a lot of ways to get that in these places. The roads don't exist yet. There's a dirt track that the work crews are cleaving next to the telegraph line. And the supply chain for most of these stations was cameleers, who came twice a year with all the goods and supplies, and in turn also created an entire new economy. The first cameleers are the first bank accounts. The Bank of South Australia, their first account is one of these men. Elders starts out as a camel franchise as well as a cattle station. This also brings new voices and new ideas and new practices to all of these places, and it became a whole way of opening up the country, right? Because the path the cameleers trod next to the telegraph line becomes a road, becomes the Stuart Highway, becomes a road. If you've ever driven from Adelaide to Darwin, you have been on or near to the path that the cameleers trod and the telegraphy laid. And of course, like all systems of this ilk, when you build it, a whole lot of things happen that you didn't anticipate. We sometimes talk about unintended consequences, and I tend to think in the 21st century, there are very few unintended consequences. There are merely choices we make and things we tolerate. In the 1800s, there were clearly places where people didn't know what a globally connected system would do because there hadn't been that many of them. In Australia, what it meant to put a repeater station next to water holes, interrupting song lines on people's sacred country, created extraordinary disruptions and conflict and profound violations of things that people cared about. Repeater stations became sites of conflict, they became ration depots, they became places of colonial contact and incredible dislocation. And the corridor that telegraphy opened up brought with it mining and exploration and agriculture and cattle and sheep, and all of that profoundly changed a place that had been enduring for tens of thousands of years. I'm not sure that when people built this system, they fully understood that, except that it's also clear when you read the documents, they did understand what they were doing was making Australia a nation, that this was about connecting an unconnected land, that it was about going through the empty heart and bringing it through. So there's clearly some sense here about what the nation building they imagined they were doing were. Todd is sometimes really poetic about it. He says that he thought the telegraph line was a highway of hopes and wishes from the Antipodes to the Mothers in England. He sometimes talks about it as a great electrical chain. I think we can also talk about it as one of the first and most explicitly coherent dislocations that happens in a season across a whole vector of Australia. We don't often talk about telegraph as a moment in the colonial frontier, but I think of telegraph time and this corridor as being very particular and in some ways quite underexplored by some of my older fields. If there were unintended consequences, there were also unexpected consequences, which are slightly different. So I said at the beginning that Todd was charged by his old boss, observatory, weather, telegraphy. He gets telegraphy done. He builds an observatory. Quietly in the background, he's also doing weather because he asks every station master of every telegraph station to collect and share the weather every morning. If you were a station master, in addition to all your other jobs, you were given a barometer, a weather vane, and a temperature scale. And every morning you were responsible for reading those devices and sending the information to Adelaide. And every morning at 8 a.m, they cleared the line. And every morning at 8 a.m, they send all the messages in. And every day, Todd made a weather map about what he was seeing. And if at some point today you picked up your phone and looked at the bomb because you thought, I really can't work out what season we're in currently and how hot will it be today, the underlying original data sets in the bomb are the ones that Todd and all his telegraphists collected at every weather station. Todd's the one who identified the southern dipole, the Europeans. He's the one that worked out if it was raining in Eucla, it would probably rain in Renmark later. He's the one who, because every telegraph station becomes a weather station, has full coverage and a full pattern and uses those to collect information and send it back through the line. It's also the case that if you now have these places running and these lines and all this infrastructure, for a while it's just invisible. Telegraphy just happens. If you're living in Melbourne or Sydney, You're not thinking about Strangways or the Peak or Charlotte Waters or Barrow Creek. There may be names you occasionally hear and you only hear them because the line has failed there. They're not part of your imagination of how information comes to you. If you're sitting in an Australian city in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you know the Telegraph because your newspaper is called the Daily Telegraph. You know it because there are these news services that aggregate information that turns up in your news. That's how Reuters and AAP come into existence. You know about the Telegraph because you know information is turning up in real time. You're not really thinking about the systems, and the only time you see them is when they break, which is a common phenomenon we understand. At the turn of the 20th century, new technologies emerge. Telegraphy is partnered with telephony, and number 6 fencing wire gives way to copper, and a few other things that are slightly better. Telephony and telegraphy are also paired with various forms of wireless technology because the radio is coming, and Marconi and Tesla are making experiments and creating new ways of thinking about all of this stuff. And some of these systems fall into abeyance. But the Overland Telegraph Line is still running. 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. The last signal down the line is 1979. So a system built in 1872 stays good until 1979. Most of us are never going to build a system that lasts that long, and I'm always kind of a bit mesmerized by it. Over time, the repeater stations wax and wane, other things get added to them. New copper gets added to the line. The repeater stations are automated. You don't need a bloke sitting there anymore typing all the messages in. You don't have a camel train, you get a highway. But the reality is the names of those original repeater stations, a whole lot of them we know. Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Catherine, Darwin. We know them because the settlements that grew up there grew up around telegraph stations. We know them because those places became points of infrastructure and points of settlement. We also know them because they are stops on the highway. They become stops on the highway in the 20th century when cars come to Australia and people start to get bored of driving around Sydney and Melbourne and decide they're going to go other places. And in a classic Australian way, they decide they're going to go other places in ways that seem really extreme and kind of bonkers. 1907 is the first time someone tries to drive from Adelaide to Darwin using the dirt road next to the telegraph track. It takes them 45 days. Don't think they were happy when they were done. First time it becomes competitive is in the 1920s when a guy named Birdsall does it in 8 days, which truthfully isn't bad because it's a dirt road. He's having to carry his own fuel, build from fuel depots because we don't have petrol stations at this point. In 1929, 2 women, Catherine Howe and Jean Robertson, in an Italian sports car given to Jean by her dad, a Lancia Lombarda, if you care for the detail, convertible. They drive it from Melbourne to Darwin. They're sponsored by Shell, who put fuel out at depots for them and who asked them in exchange to make a map for them and take photographs and share them with the newspapers. Sounds like influencing, but I'm not sure that's what they called it at the time. But if as a kid you had one of those flip maps that unfolded the road for you, or you had a Shell travelling map of Australia, Jean and Kathleen did the prototype in 1929. That wasn't enough for them. They then set a land speed record between Perth and Adelaide, and then that wasn't enough, and they did collectively drive from Melbourne to London, as you do. But the highway follows the telegraph line, and the highway follows a line set before, and the highway infected the Australian imagination in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and through to this day, and we are still in some ways enacting a set of passages that follow data. Because it turns out the choices we made in the 1870s still shape the world we live in today. This is a photo taken of a piece of the line south of Mari. Andrew and I took this about 2 years ago. I told him to stop the car and put up a drone. We argued about it, and then we did. And the reason I wanted it was I thought this is what you could see. Because here, you can barely tell the Overland Telegraph Line went. Some of the poles are still here. And there's the Ghan Railway. And there's the road. There's the NBN, right up the middle. And if you know how to read an Australian landscape, you can see that that washes out occasionally. You can sort of see the water through there. Because it turns out when Babbage and Roberts and Mitchell and Patterson and Stewart were surveying this area, they're looking for water. Because what do you need to survive as a human? Water. And they're following old walking tracks in this area of the Kukada and the Arabana and the Diri further north of the Walpre and the Kaiditch and the Algara and the Warramungu. They're looking for water. They're following walking tracks. And telegraphy liked water. You needed it for batteries and humans and all the other things that humans and batteries needed. The train really likes water too, so it's following along the same line. And the government creates an excision for all of those things because we know that makes life easier. And so you put the road near all of it because that's also convenient. And then you put the NBN in because you built the whole thing out anyway and you've carved out your space. But it turns out where telegraphy and railway might have liked water, NBN and roads don't. And yet the choices we made in the 1840s and 50s and 60s and 70s shaped the world in the 21st century too. And so if there is a parable here, it is this. When you seek to build a system, the choices you make are never the choices of this moment. They are choices that will continue to shape that system and the things that are built around it for decades, if not centuries. And if this was a parable, the second arc of that parable is to say it is very easy for us to imagine that it's always just about the technology. But the reality is it's never a single technology and it's never just a technology. Because to make and sustain and hold a system, you need expert labor, you need clear rules and parameters for that labor, you need an imagination of that labor, you need a sense that there is a reason why it is all unfolding. And when it's all said and done, it won't just be about the technology and the human labor, it will also be about the stories we tell about it and the way we hold those stories a century and a half later and the way we continue to pass the messages through. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank
you. Thank you very much. That was really scintillating insights on what started with a few wires across a very long distance. We can now move on to questions for a few minutes to Genevieve. We do have one online there, which comes from Trevor Bird. And Trevor Bird wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on the local consequences. And he sort of referred also to patterns of exploration
absolutely.
across Australia and the discovery of other parts of Australia by the white populations. Also wondered if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on First Nations consequences in a local context.
Look, there are other people who are much better to do the latter than I, and First Nations people who are working through the stories of their own country, and I want to be respectful of all of those. I think Trevor is absolutely right to identify that the line also became a place that opened up exploration, initially in the form of mining. So when people were surveying the country between Darwin and Catherine, they discovered gold. And so Yam Creek, Shackle, Pine Creek all grow up around that exploration. There are similar discoveries of other valuable minerals around Tennant Creek and also down at the Peak. And so there are multiple places where it turns out digging holes to stick poles in, you find other things. And so part of it, you get exploration there. I think there's also a little bit about you start to establish critical mass. And so in multiple of these places, townships grow up. But interestingly, certainly in the Northern Territory, less so in South Australia, what we now know as South Australia, the Northern Territory. In the Northern Territory, each one of the telegraph stations was given a piece of land that was excised around it that was designed to be land enough to run cattle and goats so that you had food for the people in the telegraph station. And as a result, in Alice and Tennant and Catherine, the telegraph station and the town have a little bit of distance between them. So the telegraph station is the government precinct and the town grows up a little bit away from it. So if you think about Alice Springs, if you've been there, the telegraph station is on one side of a mountain range and the town is on the other. Tennant Creek, the same thing. What that also means is that those buildings and places ended up having other lives. In Alice Springs, complicatedly, the telegraph station becomes something called the Bungalow, which is one of the centres of stolen generation activity in Central Australia and has a genuinely awful, shameful past as a place that kids were taken away from their parents. So it's complicated that way, obviously. There are multiple other histories around each one of those telegraph stations that are complicated, and the stories around them are not the same from station to station because we're talking about different nations with different stories and cultural practices. But the reality is it is a almost simultaneous disruption of life along a single corridor in a way that pastoralism simply didn't engender.
Thank you. Thank you. That's such a rich past. Now, are there questions? Joe, I see, and we've got the mic. Joe, to help you. Second to Joe, who else would like to ask questions? Perfect, Ken.
Thanks, Genevieve. I think what I found interesting is the two places in Australia where the line starts and finishes are not major centres of economic activity at that time. And so Sydney and Melbourne, which were, are actually off to the side. And so some of this innovation actually occurs in areas where you wouldn't necessarily expect it, and yet it gave them life in the longer term.
Yeah, and look, there was an enormous amount of effort, as you can imagine, politically and in the political economy and military strategies, I think, of Australia to control the northern coastline. And so for Todd and his contemporaries in the South Australian government, they wanted to be able to be the ones that established the northernmost facing city. And so they send Goyder of the Goyder Line, does the original surveying of what then becomes Port Darwin and Palmerston, and that's in 1868, 69, 70. And it's very much with the idea of holding that and holding a corridor. And so no small part of this is tied up with all the other kind of moves around politics and exploration in the 1860s. So think Burke and Wills, who are trying to make a mad dash to prove there can be a corridor that Victoria and Queensland would like to sort of control. You've got Sturt and McDonald Stewart doing the same thing. So there are multiple kind of moments of attempting to make those pieces. Look, I think what's interesting about Darwin from that moment of Goyder sort of stabilising the street maps through until the present time is that Darwin is very unlike a lot of other Australian centres at this moment in time. It's incredibly multicultural, has a really strong Chinese hub from 1870 onwards. It has a very strong set of people coming from multiple places who end up there. And while it might not register on the rest of the Australian radar, it is very much facing north from there, and I think it has a very different kind of life and an unfolding there. For Adelaide, we may not think of it as an economic powerhouse in the 21st century, although I think increasingly South Australia would like to change that. In this period of time, South Australia is a really rich intellectual hub. It has a strong patenting tradition. By the 19-teens and 20s, it's actually really important in terms of cultural transformation. So think of the Jindy Warrabaks and the Angry Penguins. So early forms of radical social enterprise in terms of the arts and creativity. It has the largest number of radio licenses anywhere in Australia in this period of time. It is where the Braggs are and get the Nobel Prize for their work in radio, among other things. Todd is doing all this stuff. So I think there's a bunch of things happening there that are the consequence of telegraphy coming through. But then there are also other places that push harder on other technologies. So Todd is clearly convinced about telegraphy and radio, and that's he and Bragg. Elsewhere, you start to see people becoming centres of electrification instead. So Sydney is clearly one of the places that electrifies much sooner than other places. Melbourne has some other things that it's doing. So I also think there's a little bit about who betted on what technology. I wouldn't want to go that far, but there is a little bit about who has what technological apparatus and how they're playing it out. And really interesting works on the kind of political economy of telegraphy and the way it maps into the forming of the Commonwealth. So if you think about when we federate in 99 to 1901, when the Acts of Parliament get written, there's a law for laws, as you do. There's laws about taxation. There's laws about, classically, taxing alcohol and beer, two separate laws. And then the next law is a law about telegraphy and about what passes on the telegraph system, what the rate system should be, who can control it. And when the earliest version of the APSs created, the Australian Public Service, 80% of the first generation of workers in the APS are telegraphy and postal. Because what other system do we have to nationalise at that point? There aren't roads everywhere, there isn't rail everywhere. And it does have a delightful piece of arcana. So I shouldn't keep picking on Western Australia, but they did choose to adopt a different telegraphy standard than the rest of Australia when they finally do get telegraphy. And so Eucla on the West Australia, South Australian border had the largest telegraph station outside of the capital cities because it was the Albury-Wodonga train platform of telegraphy. The West Australian telegraphs came in, had to be handwritten and passed over a glass partition to be recoded and go down the South Australian side of the line. They both had different technology standards and different Morse codexes. And so this Eucla was this mad. You look at the pictures and you're like, I know Eucla is on the map. Why do we have this mad telegraph station? The telegraph station really is about how you pass information backwards and forwards over a glass station. So I think part of it is also about what happens at Federation and the role that telegraphy plays in giving people an imagination of what you can federate.
And communications, that was an asset. Ken.
Thanks for a great talk, Genevieve. Interesting to see the technical and geographic interplay here going on. And of course, in modern times, the same route is planned for the Sun Cable project from Julia Creek to Darwin and then Darwin to Singapore if they ever get that far.
Because there's only so many places you can stick cables on the bottom of the ocean that are flat and good.
Exactly.
They knew most of them in the 1870s.
Yeah, it's going to follow the same route. So also reflecting on the data rate that they were able to achieve in those days. I mean, if your Morse code was pretty good, your data rate was like a bit a second or something like that. Whereas now with fibre pairs, you can get tens of terabytes a second, and there are many fibre pairs in a cable under the ocean. But what I'm interested in knowing, I don't know if you have information on this, is of course, these modern systems run flat out the whole time, but obviously there were breaks in the line and that sort of thing. So do we have an idea of the sort of downtime of the system in those days, and also the fidelity? So,
yep.
You know, how much corruption of the signal was there through multiple repeated, telegraph stations, all that sort of thing?
Yeah, look, so both good questions. Disruptions to the line had to be recorded and shared with Parliament, and they were. So they were tabled every year of how long the line was down and for what reasons. It was down a lot in the first 2 years, and then they worked out most of the kinks out of the line, and it went down very infrequently after that. The big outages were usually to do with rain, so lines washing out, and they got really adroit at fixing those. There were some disruptions to the submarine cables due to undersea volcanic activity, which you can imagine would be a problem between Indonesia and Australia. One particularly poor constellation of Australian on-land disruptions and under-ocean disruptions led to the Eastern Telegraphy Company putting in a backup system. So if you've ever wondered why Cable Beach in Broome is called Cable Beach, it is called Cable Beach because it was where the second telegraph undersea cable came up. And so they ran a backup line from Broome down to Perth and over on the east-west line from Perth to Adelaide to manage some of the disruption. And they also started to put systems into Sydney to bring Sydney online independently of everyone else. So disruptions were infrequent. There were multiple years where there were none. There were some years when it was days at a time. In all those instances, it made the newspapers as soon as there was a disruption, and Todd took it upon himself annually to list all the disruptions by hour and between which stations. And they had backup systems running between stations, human obviously, which was a little bit tricky. So there's that piece. And the second question had to do with fidelity.
Yeah.
So look, there was an early move in Australia, as there was globally, to introduce codexes so that people would have ciphers so that they could protect their messages. And the telegraphists insisted that not happen because they found when people were using ciphers, they couldn't correct the noise in the system. And so what most good telegraphists could do was actually they'd tidy messages up as they went through. So they'd hear them, they'd correct spelling mistakes, they'd make sense of things and pass them through. And they found when people were using ciphers, they couldn't do the fixing and the tidying up. All of them had to sign up to information privacy. So they were very clear that if they heard things, they couldn't benefit from them. So there was a lot of stuff about laws around data and data privacy are actually driven by how telegraphy worked. Worst place for fidelity was under the oceans, which is why you see so many hops in the sort of the 1860s and 70s. They're still trying to work out what the best mix of materials, electricity and throughput is. The first systems underwater are terrible, and they try and fix it by increasing the voltage, and it blows the system out, and it takes them years to get kind of back to there. Most of these systems ran 24/7. The challenge in the early days in Australia was only one wire, so it had to be directional. So messages pass south for half the day and north for the other half. So you have some interesting kind of optimization strategies that people are having. They go to 2 lines very quickly. They go to quite sophisticated sounders in each repeater station, but there's obviously some very highly skilled operators working here. In some British Commonwealth countries, of which Australia is one, and there's some evidence of this, you would dock your pay for message errors.
Quality is coming
Yeah, so there's
in.
quality control.
That's-
And so you also then have strategies that people use to control the line and lock it down. So there's at least one account in Western Australia of someone who wants to send a message out because they've found gold and they want to control the network, of taking an entire piece of Shakespeare and having it 6,000 word message in order to lock down the line so that they can control it until they can get their own word through. So we have those kind of forms of sort of naughtiness that are happening, but at least in the case of the Overland Telegraph Line, it is they don't recoup the original investment cost until the 20th century. So the first 30 years it runs at a loss, both for equipment and personnel, and the sheer cost of it. The volume of traffic doesn't get you to a reasonable ROI until the 20th century. And so there's also something for me there about how much you might need to invest in a system until it is profitable because of the change state that it brought. But you see a kind of change in traffic rates. The first year there's not so much, and then it steadily builds every year after that. And they also record the traffic on the line, and you see this very clear increase in traffic rates.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful moment to end the responses to the questions. You know, on that growth of traffic, but the long time duration for returns, and therefore the role for public and private together in all of this. But this was a fascinating story, and the implications of drawing out the confluence of technologies in this parable, the ways in which personalities played in all of this, and circumstance and possibilities and vision. And so individuals with technologies and innovations at different points of the world, and you've shown us so well how from the US to UK to Europe to Germany to Australia, Adelaide, so on, brought together the pieces of complementary technology, we could say. As you said, it's not just one technology, but it's that larger context. And the other side of all of that was the unintended and unexpected consequences that emerge. All of these spillovers, which were positive and not always quite so positive, that go along with technologically powered change, and that has run through to today and changed our visions of how we can think about Australia in the future. So I'd like to thank you for a really amazing oration. This was really superb, very thoughtful. Of course, this will be on the YouTube channel for anybody who would like to listen again, or for any of your colleagues, please mention it to your colleagues who would like to listen later on the YouTube channel from the Academy. So it's been a great honour and a great pleasure, Genevieve, to listen to you. And thanks to all the audience, and thanks also to ANU for the facilities.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you very much.